Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Theresa May is meeting senior cabinet ministers in an effort to make progress on the stalled Brexit talks. They're expected to discuss the so-called divorce bill. That's the money the UK needs to pay on leaving the EU, with some Conservatives warning the government not to play Santa Claus by handing over tens of billions of pounds. Today, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, said Brussels was ready to offer the UK the most ambitious trade deal, but only if its terms are met. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
Number 10 is always a special place to visit. But today, the scene of vital conversations for the core of the cabinet. Crucial meetings to decide if Theresa May can hold out the promise of billions more to Brussels. She's already promised nearly 20 billion to clean up our accounts as we leave.
We've been very clear that we will honour our commitments, but what I want to see is developing that deep and special partnership with the European Union for the future, and I want to see us moving together because, as I've always said, a deal that's good for the UK will be a deal that's good for the rest of the European Union.
But what else should we pay for? The Prime Minister wants to concentrate on how to grow industry today, with more cash promises for research and development 2 days before the budget.
Hello.
Yet she can't ignore tensions in government over the handling of the financial deal with Brussels, where it's also a red carpet day. And there's no doubt about what the other European nations think British ministers must decide.
Do you want more money from the UK to move the Brexit talks?
If you missed it, yes to more cash from the Germans. And the Dutch say get on with it.
I've seen a lot of signals, but that's happening for a few months now. So it has to be concrete and on the table instead of in the press.
But with the Germans without a government and potentially holding new elections, there could be plenty of hold-ups on the EU side too. The chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said the UK can't have the benefits of the single market when we leave. But if we pay up and come up with a deal on the Northern Irish border...
If we manage to negotiate an orderly withdrawal, there is every reason for our future partnership to be ambitious. This is our preferred option.
But even hinting at paying billions for that could cause trouble at home.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer has got very limited scope for manoeuvre. He cannot afford to play Santa Claus to Juncker and Tusk. He needs to ensure that we're only paying exactly for what are our obligations, for what we are absolutely contracted for.
You'll be talking about money today.
But who will be the most persuasive? The Foreign Secretary, who promised we'd get money back from Brexit, or his colleagues like the Home Secretary, far from in step on how and when to dangle the money?
This is so politically sensitive that cabinet ministers say they're not even talking actual numbers yet. Tonight's decision is whether Theresa May is allowed to go to Brussels on Friday with a clear signal that Britain is willing to pay more. The Tories' top table is so divided, the party so fractured on this issue, that it's a choice Theresa May cannot make on her own. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
But first, Theresa May and key cabinet ministers met tonight to decide whether or not to increase Britain's EU divorce payment. There's speculation that the Prime Minister will double the total amount she offers in a bid to kick-start negotiations over post-Brexit trade. But some Tory backbenchers say the money would be better spent at home, as our political correspondent Carl Dinnan reports.
The UK's current offer on the Brexit bill is to pay for £20 billion worth of commitments. Today, it's thought ministers could agree to double that to £40 billion worth. Although there are those in the EU who think £60 billion is the true value of the UK's commitments.
And so do you all get to do the sort of chaos bit and then...
The Prime Minister doesn't like to put a number on these things. After watching apprentices at work today, she would only repeat that no one would miss out.
No other EU country needs fear that they will have to receive less or pay in more. We've been very clear that we will honour our commitments. But what I want to see is developing that deep and special partnership with the European Union for the future. And I want to see us moving together because, as I've always said, a deal that's good for the UK will be a deal that's good for the rest of the European Union.
But the EU won't start talks about that deal, so the question for ministers meeting this afternoon was whether to stump up more to get them talking. Backbenchers are warning against offering a bigger sum.
We have huge public spending pressures at home. We need more money on our hospitals, we need more money on our schools, we need more money for apprenticeships. We need to help with the people with the cost of living, and then suddenly we say we've got up to 40 billion to give to the European Union. I think the public would go bananas if we gave that amount of money to Europe.
But even if trade talks do start soon, the EU's chief negotiator warned British financial firms could not expect the free access, known as passporting, they currently enjoy.
Brexit means Brexit. Everywhere. The legal consequence of Brexit, the legal consequence, is that the UK financial service providers lose their EU passport.
But before we even get to that point, the issue of the so-called Brexit bill must be settled, first in Westminster, then Brussels.
Well, Carl's in Downing Street then still. So have they agreed yet then to pay that bigger bill?
Well, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd said it had been a good meeting when she left a little earlier, but apart from that, they're all staying very, very tight-lipped. This is an incredibly sensitive subject. You heard there that Tory backbenchers aren't happy with more money being offered. The public would also have to be persuaded. The omens going into the meeting were good. Even Brexiteers like Boris Johnson weren't dead set against offering more money, so long as it was tied to a good end deal. Theresa May will take whatever decision has been made here to Brussels at the end of the week. We'll find out more then.
OK, Carl Dinnan on Downing Street, thank you.
Well, Britain's Brexit bill could be double the amount that Theresa May offered the EU in September. The critical cabinet committee in charge of making the decision has just finished meeting in Downing Street. The EU says without that promise of extra money, the talks will not move on to the future trading relationship. And the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has also warned Britain against diverging too far from the European economic model. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. What does all that mean?
Well, that cabinet committee, the expectation in Whitehall was that that meeting would give Theresa May the authority to explore exactly what extra money given to Europe would buy Britain back in the Brexit negotiations. As you say, it's just really broken up fairly recently. No signs yet that it didn't run according to plan. Maybe some surprise in some circles when you see the cast list walking through the door. Arch Brexiteers, people who led the Vote Leave campaign going in there. Why would they want to give Brussels more money? I think the point to remember there is how fixated those people are by making sure that above all else they get Brexit, and also more fixated than they are on the money on the end deal, which they hope will see Britain diverge from Europe in quite significant ways as it leaves. On that front, very interestingly, as you mentioned, Michel Barnier, the EU negotiator today, saying diverge too much and you'll find that EU parliaments won't ratify, won't sign off on the deal. You might not get it. On that as well, another complication, of course, Chancellor Merkel, not clear whether she's going to be entirely stable, full of authority, as you were just hearing, central to the European plot, as many people think she needs to be if Europe is to sign off on anything constructive or significant. All of that happening on the very day that Britain, that was handed prizes, as it were, for good or goodish behaviour as an EU member, authorities, bodies that were put in Britain by the EU and brought jobs with them, has today more or less had to hand those back to the prize-giving authority. And that is because, of course, Britain is leaving.
Welcome to Copenhagen. Hopefully the future home for the European Medicines Agency.
Bratislava is young.
24 European cities have been picking over the spoils of Brexit. The EU Medicines Agency and the Banking Authority can't stay in London, and they're up for grabs.
Of course, they're very welcome to move to the Netherlands. We also have a very stylish queen and enjoy fish and chips.
In the last hour, Amsterdam won the competition to host the EU medicines body, which now moves across the North Sea from London. Paris snatched the banking body from London and will hope that helps to attract other finance jobs in its wake. Michel Barnier, the Brexit negotiator, speaking in Brussels, suggested some British politicians were slow learners and still deluding themselves that they could shed EU laws and regulations but not lose business from London's financial sector.
On financial services, UK voices suggest that Brexit does not mean Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Everywhere.
Mr Barnier suggested that the UK could find the more it chooses to diverge from EU rules, the greater the chance of not getting such a deal signed off by EU parliaments.
It will shape the discussion on our future relationship and shape also, be careful, on the condition for ratification of that partnership in many national parliaments and obviously in the European Parliament. And I don't say that to create problems, I just say that to avoid the problems.
The Prime Minister, with the Chancellor visiting an engineering company in the West Midlands today, hasn't dared start a full cabinet discussion yet on how close to the EU Britain wants to end up. But after this trip, they both return to London to meet with a powerful group of ministers to decide what extra money the UK should offer Brussels to break the deadlock in the talks. The Cabinet Committee at the centre of Brexit decision-making has 5 ministers led by the Chancellor and the Home Secretary who supported Remain, 4 ministers who backed Leave, including the Foreign Secretary and the Environment Secretary. The Prime Minister chairs the meeting and has told colleagues she sees it as her duty to steer a path between these two factions. Whitehall sources say there's some agreement here that the government should probably consider offering something like £20 billion on top of the £18 billion already pledged. Former ministers are amongst those who aren't convinced.
I think the public will go bananas and be quite outraged that there is suddenly money found from the back of a Treasury sofa to be spent on giving to the EU when we need that money spent at home.
And they'll punish the Tories for it, you think?
I think we'll be hit really badly because the public won't understand it.
We do need clarity as to what we're paying for. And certainly I think that additional money should not be offered unless it's made absolutely clear to the EU that that is strictly conditional upon them talking to us seriously about our future trade relationship.
There's been some pragmatism on display by pro-Leave cabinet ministers over paying extra money to Brussels. There may be less on display if and when this same committee starts talking about what post-Brexit Britain should look like.
Well, joining us now is the director of the policy think tank Open Europe, Henry Newman, a former advisor to the leading Brexiteer Michael Gove, and from Westminster, the Labour MP Alison McGovern. Henry Newman, £38 billion, that wasn't on the side of the bus, was it?
Well, I think the question here is how do we get to the next stage in the negotiations?
No, hang on. I asked you whether it was on the side of the bus.
I mean, obviously it wasn't, but I think equally nobody was under any illusion that we wouldn't have to do anything other than...
So what happened to your hard Brexit?
I don't think this is about hard or soft Brexit. This is about progressing the negotiations. The EU has, and I regret their decision, decided to separate the negotiations into 2 phases. And it's about getting out of the first phase, the withdrawal phase. And to do that, we need to make sufficient progress. And I'm perfectly relaxed about us meeting our obligations as long as it's contingent on the EU agreeing to talk trade and get on with discussing what sort of future relationship we're going to have.
But then you're a Brexiteer think tanker rather than somebody who has some constituents to think about.
Well, I mean, I worked for a think tank that was non-aligned during the referendum. I myself was for Brexit, but I think all my staff were for Remain. Many of them campaigned for Remain. I'm not working for an aligned organisation, but I think what everybody wants, constituents, people in this country, is the country to get on with delivering Brexit and creating the certainty that businesses want.
Alison McGovern, you've presumably been party to seeing off the hard Brexit, but it's now becoming a rather expensive entity. I mean, how far are MPs who are Remainers prepared to see this bill rise?
Well, we've got to pay for our liabilities. You know, the British reputation for being fair has stood us in good stead. But actually, funnily enough, I would agree with Henry in that we need to move on to what the eventual arrangements are going to be, because that's the way we'll give business stability and we'll be able to get a Brexit deal. And the problem that the Prime Minister has got is actually much bigger than the details of the bill, divided though her cabinet seems to be on that. There isn't really a consensus in the cabinet, it seems to me, from observing in Parliament, on exactly what kind of economy or Brexit arrangements we're going to have in the end. And unless we know that here in Britain, we will find it very hard to negotiate with an EU who does know what it wants.
Well, looking in from inside, can you see harmony ever breaking out on what kind of a Brexit this cabinet actually wants?
Well, I should say from the start, I'm not here to represent Michael Gove.
No, I'm saying looking from outside. You're not an MP, so can you see anything in the cabinet which represents some kind of harmony?
I think there is actually agreement on the Brexit bill. I think there is a discussion to be had as to what sort of relationship we want in the future. But there's much less disagreement.
Well, hang on a minute. Therefore you think you see Philip Hammond and Michael Gove absolutely in harmony.
No, they agree on the Lancaster House policy, which was to leave the single market and leave the customs union. Now, I think if you speak to Alison and her colleagues, they don't accept that. But I think that the cabinet is very clear that if Brexit is going to be delivered in a way that the public voted for, that entails leaving the single market and leaving the customs union.
Oh, you're satisfied that the people who voted did know about the single market and did know. So all that was they did vote to leave the single market.
I think if you look
Do you remember anybody saying much about the single market during the campaign?
I remember watching interviews with Michael Gove, with Boris Johnson, with David Cameron and George Osborne, all of whom made it very clear that voting leave would entail leaving the single market. And there's not a single major non-EU member who is in the customs union with the EU. The only exception is Monaco, which is, I don't think it's a particular model for our future customs policy. So I think we're going to need to, if we're going to make a success of Brexit, we accept the costs that come with leaving the single market, come with leaving the customs union, but those allow us to grasp the opportunities that are available.
Alison, do I detect from your comments so far that you actually want to make a success of Brexit rather than in any way resist it?
Well, I am led by my constituents, actually, and when in the general election, I said to them, I think the most important thing to do now is to make a deal. Most of them, those who voted leave and remain, agreed we need to get this done because this is actually holding our economy back now.
So therefore, are you comforted by Michel Barnier saying today that he's looking for the most ambitious trade deal that he's ever negotiated?
Well, I think that's a really good thing. The question is, what are the economic models that underpin that deal? And basically, our choice as a country is, do we want the kind of high standards and market that has rules applied to it that protect ordinary working people and that protect us as consumers, in which case we'll probably find it easier to make a deal with the European Union? Or do we want to follow the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg and his people in the cabinet, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and others, who want to rip up all the rules that currently govern our economy and say, forget all that, we need to have no rules so that we can trade around the world? And actually, I think the British people quite like having standards and they quite like having rights at work. So I think that it would be the right thing to do to say that Britain will maintain a lot of the rules and standards that it's had as part of the EU. That will make it a lot easier to get a deal.
And presumably you'd find harmony with Alison McGovern on jobs and the interests of the working man and woman.
The Prime Minister has been quite clear that she doesn't want to change employment rights in this country. The Environment Secretary said he wants to extend environmental rights. I think the question is regulation for the future. We've had obviously discussion over the weekend about automation, driverless cars, big data as well. These are the growth areas of the future. And we know that the EU may want to shift its regulation in a certain direction. The UK may want to take a different path. So that's the area of the future potential disagreement. How do we, in the future, evolve our regulation over these key growth areas? And we might want to take a different direction from Brussels.
Henry Newman and Alison McGovern, thank you both very warmly.
Let's start with Brexit divorce matters, shall we? All over the front pages. Starting with the Telegraph, Johnson and Gove, the Brexiteers, obviously back a bigger Brexit divorce bill offer.
Yeah, the great
it's not
British,
there, is it? I'll get up
the great British breakup with Europe on here. But May is cleverly now pulling in her Brextremists, her boys, Johnson and Gove, of course, who were in the campaign against her, to get them to agree to the extra money. It was not so long ago Johnson was talking about go whistle for a large amount of money, but he seems to be.
Well, that's part of any negotiation. I mean, this is like going through.
It's not
a
very
divorce.
good, that is it? He says go whistle a month ago, and now he's signing the cheque.
But that's what you would say to your soon-to-be ex-husband.
Or your ex-27 partners, your neighbours,
exactly.
as you wave goodbye to them.
Yes, no, I think this is exactly how a divorce carries through.
So,
we
as a
should be
Brexiteer,
relaxed.
Harriet, are you happy with 38, 40 billion, whatever it ends up being?
Well, I think we've moved. On one hand, I think this whole thing is completely mad. I mean, we have a
Brexit.
debt No.
I mean,
we have
you voted for it.
No, the money.
Brexit's mad.
Debt. I never said that, Kevin.
God.
We have a debt of 1.8, trillion. And we've told we have absolutely no money to do anything, and yet we're sort of throwing 40 or 50 billion at the EU as part of this divorce proceedings.
So clearly, when they say, we can walk away with no deal, the government really does not mean that if you're prepared to offer 40 billion in order not to have a no-deal situation.
No, they all know a no deal will be catastrophic. Even Nigel Farage has privately said it would be yeah, he does. A friend of mine sidled up to him in Lisbon Airport, didn't say who he was, and just engaged him in a conversation. And he knows it's not unusual for politicians to say one thing in public and another in private. And they know no deal would be catastrophic, cataclysmic. It's why now there's a 2-year transition period being talked about. Maybe it might have to be longer. But if we're heading for Brexit, and both the Conservatives and Labour is committed to Brexit too, although the type of Brexits are different, and both parties have splits, but nevertheless they know it will be catastrophic. And you've got to fulfil.
This is the Brexit betrayal is how he's describing this evening.
Is he? There we are. How funny. He knows.
Why is that so funny?
Well, because he knows that no deal would be a bad position. He's actually said it.
Yes, but you have to take that position in order to get any kind of deal. I mean, this is why I get so quite fed up with Leave voters who are saying, well, you can't say no deal. Of course you have to. You have to have that sort of...
Well, look, if the other 27...
If you're negotiating, you have to be prepared to walk away, otherwise you're in a weak position.
If the other 27 won't do a deal with you, you'd have no deal. But of course, the truth is, they want a deal too. We do have some cards. I think they've got the stronger hand, but you do have some cards because they do still want to sell us stuff. We're still a significant market for the other 27 there.
And they've got a huge, they've got all their pensions that they've got to pay for the bureaucrats. I mean, this is the real problem. The real problem is those bureaucrats and their pensions in the EU, and that they've got a huge hole, and so they desperately need that money.
I wonder how much of the money actually goes to pensions. I often think that's overstated, but we've taken other legal obligations, although that's sometimes disputed. But David Davis is a Brexiteer, Boris Johnson a Brexiteer, Gove a Brexiteer, Fox a Brexiteer. They all accept we have some obligations, you've got to pay something.
Yes,
it's doubled already, it may not be the end of it. It wasn't down the side of the bus, it wasn't 40 billion or whatever for the European Union for a divorce payment, it was 350 million for the NHS, which doesn't exist. So I can see why when Robert Halfon says people who's another Brexiteer, I think he was a Brexiteer at the time. Anyway, he says people will go bananas. Well, it's true. Leavers were deceived on this. There's no doubt about it.
Well, on what? On what?
On the payments. They thought it was sold as you're going to get loads of money coming back.
I never
now
met
you've got 40 billion going the other way.
Money thing.
The 350 million
that I interviewed at the time said to me quite openly, we are going to be worse off. They expected to be worse off.
People are voting to be worse off?
Yes, that was what was so interesting and moving about that referendum, is that people expected to be worse off, but they wanted to control the borders.
Dominic Cummins, who ran Vote Leave, we'll come on to them later, actually said that 350 million quid for the NHS was crucial. Narrow referendum, remember, it was 52-48. It was crucial, he says.
I don't think so. Not
anyone. Maybe the person who ran it is wrong and you're right.
Was controlling borders and immigration. That's what was crucial.
You just don't want to admit it.
I don't think it was.
That's what it's about. You've got to just face up to the reality of what you've created and that people were sold a pup and a lie.
I don't think. I really don't think it was important. I have not yet to meet one person who did think it was important. I thought that most of the people, everyone that I have interviewed,
you want to get out and about, Harriet.
Well, I did. I was all over the country.
I've met plenty of people who were leavers, and a lot of people were leavers for different reasons. But a lot of people who were leavers thought they were going to be better off, and they're not going to be better off.
A lot of people felt that they would have more access to their local hospitals and their local schools, because at the moment they can't because of numbers.
What? Because of the Europeans working in them,
no,
providing those medical services.
Well, look at Take Schools for example. I mean, a lot of them felt that they can't get their children into, you know, the numbers in schools has absolutely rocketed.
If somebody in a house has got their kids in a school and they're living nearer than you, whether they're from Poland or can trace their line back to Alfred the Great doesn't make any difference. You're still not going to get your kids in because somebody else is living there.
Let's move back to the papers, dare I suggest.
Okay. Well, we're having so much fun.
How many years are we having this argument for? That's what I want to know.
Right, back to the papers.
But the papers are full of these arguments.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
I know. You're reflecting.
That was the Express, the Sun, the Telegraph,
Yes,
the Mail.
yes.
That was more the Guardian, the Mirror, the Times, and the FT.